Critical system thinking and sociological paradigms. Is critical system thinking useful for implementing total quality management? Now, I think that is an interesting question, because total quality management is concerned with improving the organization from a systems perspective. And often in what the literature tells us about why TQM fails often has to do with a culture of fear, manipulative management, oppression, exactly the sort of thing that critical systems thinking is trying to address. So I think there's a very interesting natural flow from the left side here down to the beyond on the right side, the beyond TQM theory by Robert Flood, articulated written in 1993, which continues to be interesting, relevant and interesting. For instance, John Beckford wrote his latest version of his book on total quality management in 2022, and he continues to argue that critical system thinking is useful for implementing total quality management. Now, critical system thinking is a combination of political thinking and psychological thinking, in the sense that it is interested in how people within the organization understand their situation. And because when you ask the people, the downtrodden, for instance, one sometimes get answers that well, it's not so bad, it's what could one expect, and so on and so on. So the three commitments to critical systems thinking, and this is called false consciousness. The first one is critical awareness. We have to get people out of this false consciousness, and we have to put them on a journey of emancipation. And the third idea is to use all sorts of relevant methods on the emancipation journey. And when we talk about different methods, these can be founded in different psychological paradigm, different scientific paradigm. And here is a way of mapping out these paradigms. On the right side, we have the objective way of thinking, which is the very typical way of how engineers, economists, natural scientists think. On the left side, the subjective side, that is the way the science of psychology, literature, studies, and things like that, where they focus on meaning, and meaning is the main thing. On the bottom, you have the typical management view, which is focused on control and regulation. On the upside, they have the workers' perspective, which is or the powerless people, the downtrodden, who are interested in making social change. So critical system thinking is a combination of is found here on which is systems thinking plus critical theory. It's found on the upper left side because it's concerned with issues like false consciousness, has to do with the subjective side, and emancipation, radical change. And when you try to, one of the ways we try to make methods based on the CST paradigm is to focus on metaphor. Metaphor is something that can find on the level between paradigm and method theory. And for each of those four paradigms you saw on the previous page, there can be, for each of those, there can be several metaphors, and for each of the metaphors, there can be several methodologies. For instance, if you look at the metaphor of the organization being like a psychic prison, that would fit with the, according to this theory, that would fit the paradigm radical humanism. So there is one single paradigm, radical humanism, fitting with that particular metaphor. But if you go down, there can be several methods where critical system heuristics, for instance, is maybe one of those methods. This is what total system intervention, this TQM implementation method, looks like. At the center of the circle, we have the unarticulated problem, what's described as a mess. And the first step of this method is called creativity, and the concern is focused on selecting a metaphor as a way of framing the mess to turn it into a problem. And then we have next step, choice, which consists of deciding on a method for dealing with the mess. The third step is implementation, producing results from implementing the method. And then we have to evaluate the results and decide on what to do next. So if you look at that from this perspective of the paradigms, we have TSI, this defined within this radical humanist paradigm, but each time we go through this TSI cycle and decide on a metaphor, we may end up in a different, for a short time, we may end up in a different paradigm, like a hard systems thinking, where we can select between methods like operational research and system theory, system dynamics, and so on, or soft system thinking, or critical system thinking, before we return to this radical humanist paradigm. So something I ask myself, many times, is why has CST-driven TQM not been more successful? Because I think this, from my understanding, in the way I read this book by Robert Flood from 1993, it's absolutely fantastic when it comes to the theoretical side of what he's writing about it. Makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, when it comes to the empirical part, I'm slightly more worried, and there are some patterns that at least strike me. And the first thing is that he's working as an independent consultant, entering into some client organization from the top, making agreements with the top management, while his political interests are at the bottom of the organization. So then it's that particular issue, and that becomes even more relevant when it starts running this cycle of this TSI cycle, starting with how to select metaphors, because I'm not sure whether top management people would really like to use metaphors like prison or a torture chamber or things like that in order to describe their own organization. So I'm not fully convinced that that is a very effective way of addressing the interest of those at the bottom of the organization. And thirdly, we have this the SOS framework for selecting methods from metaphors, and the problem there is that this SOS framework does not really make use of metaphors at all. So it's a rather strange thing. Okay, but I think all those aspects could be easily changed, easily corrected, by simply focusing on community organizational research, which means that at the first stage of creativity, we work with the community and internal consultants for selecting the metaphor, making sure that it's the metaphor represents the viewpoint of those at the bottom of the organizational ladder. When we select methods, we use the Baron-Morgan matrix, which links directly with the metaphors rather than this system of systems methodology, which I think is a failure from my perspective. And when we implement the methods, we have to follow the a structure, the plan, do, check, act structure of total quality management, to make sure that the TSI cycle is not terminated by managers who dislike the results of the intervention. So to present an example, or what is a case study in the paper, before starting the plan, do, check, act cycle, I would suggest having a default, starting with a default metaphor for an organization, and that is the instrument of domination, which is really this hand on the back of this man on the floor, as is the key metaphor for critical systems thinking, in a way, because it makes it it makes it very clear that the people we sympathize with here are the people at the bottom. They're not the hand pushing down, but the man on the floor. So when we start doing the planning and we do not really know how to articulate the problem, we do this from the viewpoint of the man on the floor, and we go into this interpretive paradigm, choose a metaphor, for instance, a text, thinking about the organization as a book or a text, something that has to be interpreted, and then we can find a suitable method like the soft systems methodology, where the first step is one of the first steps is to create a rich picture of the situation, done here, finding all the nice things that we'd like to have established, what the world will be like. Now, Peter Checkland, he didn't work exactly like that, because he was more working with the top management. But as he says in his book, there's no problem from a philosophical or a scientific perspective to integrate this with critical theory, in the sense that you can apply social systems, soft system methodology for working with labor unions or political activists or any group that want to understand their problem and create a vision for where they want to go. But after having articulated the problem and created a broad strategy, we are now interested in designing a testable intervention, and something that is more objective, that can be tested, measured and tested. And that moves us into this second paradigm, the functionalist paradigm, with lots and lots of metaphors to choose from. But I would, for instance, we can use the cybernetic system or brain metaphor, which leads us into the case of how Stafford Beer tried to support Salvador Allende in creating a socialist economy in Chile in the early 1970s. Of course, that didn't work out because of the coup d'etat from Pinochet. But nevertheless, it's an interesting case that has been written a lot about and can still be used as inspiration. And the next step after the intervention is to check. Now, in the case of Chile and Pinochet, this was a failure, so that would be the outcome of the check. But even if it had been a success, a technical success, it would be interesting to see whether people had broken out of the psychic prison, whether it helped people to, whether the cybernetic ID help people to make them critically aware. And a relevant method to use here is critical system heuristics by Ulrich Werner for creating a debate. It is a sort of debate where we look at what the world is, what the organization is like, or what the system solution is like, and what it ought to be. Here illustrated by this famous 1972 debate between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky, looking at the world, what it is like, and what it ought to be. But after having done this evaluation, it is not. We also need to look at when we're going to see what is going to happen next. We are not only interested in whether people have developed some sort of critical awareness. We want to know more objectively whether the world has changed, whether it has become less oppressive. So, in this case, for instance, if you look at the Black Lives Matter, here people are clearly critically aware in the sense that they are marching on the streets, but has if you look at the statistics, or has the problem of systemic oppression been solved, or should we plan for further action? Now, there are two lessons I want to draw from this. The first lesson has to do with the structure. And I believe that when applying CST for implementing TQM, you cannot rely on TSI on its own. It has to be controlled through this Plan, Do, Check, Act, making sure that we go through all of the four paradigms. In planning, we use the interpretivist paradigm. In the designing and doing objective interventions, we use functionalism. When checking the outcome of the interventions from a more psychological perspective, and we go into the area of radical humanism. And are interested in the objective results, we look at that from the viewpoint of radical structuralism. However, the second lesson I think is more important, and that is what I believe the key is perhaps even more important. That's the idea of moving critical system thinking and total system intervention from the radical humanist perspective into the radical structuralist paradigm. That means to found it on community operational research, and this fits as I can see very interestingly with how Stahl has been talking about the Berlin-Morgan grid in recent years. He has also done the same thing as he has while Berlin-Morgan talked about critical theory from in the upper left corner as part of the radical humanist perspective. Stahl defined it as part of the structuralist, radical structuralism, and I agree. I think it's a very important and good point, and because it makes us think about critical theory less in terms of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Habermas, but more in terms of how Marcuse took part in political activism in the 1960s and early 1970s. So, is CST useful for implementing total TQM? I believe it is very much so, but it has to be depends on a reorientation of CST towards COR. Critical system thinking is useful for implementing total quality management when reoriented towards community organizational research, as illustrated.